Map. HOA Karen sent her cop brother to seize my ranch keys, unaware he was threatening an FBI agent. The badge meant nothing when federal justice arrived at my gate today. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first thing I heard was the sound of my own gate being forced open, and I knew someone had just made the biggest mistake of their life. The cold Montana morning air cut through my jacket as I stood on the porch of my ranch, watching a black police SUV roll to a stop beside my private road. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with wet earth and pine filled the air. For 40 years, that ranch had belonged to my family. Every fence post, every worn trail, every piece of wood in that old barn carried a memory. But that morning, someone showed up believing they could take it away with a badge and a piece of paper. The officer stepped out slowly, one hand resting near his belt. His uniform was clean, his expression confident. Behind him stood Victoria Halstead, the president of Silver Pine Ranch Estates HOA, wearing a perfect smile that never reached her eyes. "Ethan Caldwell," she called out. "This is your final opportunity to cooperate." I looked at the document in her hand, but didn't move. "Cooperate with what?" I asked. Her smile sharpened. "Hand over the ranch keys. The association has determined this property is no longer compliant with community regulations." For a second, all I heard was the wind moving through the tall grass behind my house. My ranch keys. Those two words told me everything I needed to know. Victoria wasn't here to discuss a violation. She wasn't here because of a fence height or a maintenance issue. She had already decided that my land belonged to her. The officer stepped forward. "My name is Daniel Halstead," he said. "I'm here to make sure this process goes smoothly." I recognized the last name immediately. Victoria's brother. The local cop everyone in Silver Pine talked about. The man who believed wearing a badge meant people stopped asking questions. Daniel looked at me like he expected fear. Like he had done this before. Like the sight of a uniform was supposed to make every argument disappear. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched. Because Daniel had no idea who he was standing in front of. He thought he was helping his sister settle a neighborhood dispute. He didn't know that the ranch he was trying to enter was connected to an investigation I had been building for months. He didn't know the quiet man in worn boots standing on that porch wasn't just some ranch owner protecting his property. My name is Ethan Caldwell. Most people in Silver Pine knew me as the guy who fixed old fences, repaired broken equipment, and spent more time working than talking. They didn't know my real job. They didn't know why I paid such close attention to paperwork. They didn't know why I never reacted when Victoria sent violation letters, threats, and warnings. Because patience is a weapon when you know the truth. And Victoria Halstead had no idea how much evidence she was creating against herself. The first time she walked onto my property without permission, she thought she was proving she had power. The first time she sent her brother with a badge, she thought she was ending the fight. But she didn't understand something important. A badge can intimidate ordinary people. It cannot intimidate the truth. And that morning, standing at my ranch gate with Daniel reaching for the lock, I realized Victoria had just crossed a line she could never uncross. I learned something that day. The most dangerous people aren't always the ones holding the badge. Sometimes they're the ones who think the badge makes them untouchable. Long before Daniel Halstead showed up at my gate, Silver Pine Ranch had already become a battlefield. It just wasn't a battlefield with guns or fences. It was a battle over control, paperwork, and the kind of power people abuse when they think nobody can stop them. I bought that ranch 8 years earlier, but my connection to the land went back much further. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, purchased those 160 acres when the area was nothing but open fields, dirt roads, and endless skies. Back then, the loudest sound in the morning wasn't construction equipment or traffic. It was the wind moving through the grass and the old wooden barn doors creaking before sunrise. That ranch was never just property. It was where my father taught me how to repair engines, where I learned that a broken fence wasn't fixed by covering the problem. You pulled out the damaged boards, replaced what was weak, and built something stronger. Funny enough, that lesson applied to people too. When I moved back permanently, I expected a quiet life. I wanted mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons repairing equipment, and evenings watching the sunset disappear behind the mountains. Then Silver Pine Ranch Estates was built nearby. At first, I had no problem with the HOA. I paid the fees. I followed the rules. I kept my distance. But Victoria Halstead wasn't interested in neighbors. She wanted control. The first letter arrived 3 months after she became HOA president. It was printed on expensive paper, the kind people use when they want intimidation to look official. Violation notice. My ranch gate was visually inconsistent with community standards. I actually laughed when I read it. A gate that had stood there for 30 years, built by my grandfather's hands, was suddenly a problem because it didn't match the decorative entrances Victoria wanted throughout the neighborhood. I ignored the first warning. That was my mistake. Because Victoria wasn't testing whether I would fix the gate. She was testing whether I would obey. The second letter came 2 weeks later. Then the fine started. $250 for the gate. $500 for unauthorized agricultural equipment. Another charge because my old pickup truck was parked near my barn instead of inside the approved area. Every envelope had the same message hidden underneath the legal language. We decide what belongs here. I knew people like Victoria before. They don't start by taking everything. They start by taking small things. A little authority. A little control. A little piece of your freedom. Then one day, you wake up and realize they believe they own everything. The real problem started when Victoria discovered my ranch sat on land that bordered a future development project. A piece of property she believed could become much more valuable if she controlled access to it. That's when the friendly emails stopped. The threats began. She claimed my private road was actually a community access route. She claimed my gates interfered with neighborhood expansion. And finally, she claimed the HOA had the right to manage my property. That was the moment I stopped seeing Victoria as an annoying neighbor. She became someone who believed rules only mattered when they benefited her. I could have shown her my credentials. I could have ended the argument in 5 minutes. But I didn't. Because I needed to know how far she was willing to go. And Victoria Halstead was about to show me everything. She didn't know the quiet ranch owner she was trying to intimidate had spent years watching people lie, manipulate, and hide behind authority. She thought she was taking keys from a helpless homeowner. She had no idea she was unlocking the door to her own downfall. The moment Victoria smiled after hearing my refusal, I knew she wasn't looking for a solution. She was looking for a surrender. The morning after Daniel Halstead appeared at my gate, I expected things to slow down. I was wrong. People like Victoria don't retreat when someone pushes back. They escalate. They convince themselves they're not abusing power. They tell themselves they're protecting a community. And the most dangerous part is, they start believing their own lies. By the end of that week, Silver Pine Ranch Estates had turned into a place where neighbors lowered their voices when they talked about the HOA office. Nobody wanted to become Victoria Halstead's next target. I noticed it during a supply run into town. The old diner near the highway used to be where ranchers gathered every morning, drinking coffee and complaining about weather, fences, and broken tractors. But that day, the conversation changed when my name came up. "You're the ranch guy, right?" An older man asked from the counter. I nodded. He looked around before lowering his voice. "You should be careful with Victoria." I already knew that. But then he said something that caught my attention. "She's been trying to get control of that land for months." That confirmed what I suspected. This was never about a gate. It was never about community standards. It was about ownership. When I returned home that afternoon, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. The paper was thick. The HOA logo was stamped at the top in bold black letters. A demand notice. Victoria claimed my ranch violated several association agreements. She listed problems that barely made sense. My barn was visually disruptive. My equipment created an inconsistent neighborhood atmosphere. My private access road was subject to community management review. I stood there holding that letter while the wind moved through the fields behind me. The strange thing about paperwork is that it doesn't look dangerous. A gun makes people nervous. A threat makes people angry. But a carefully written document? That's how people try to steal things without making noise. I spent that evening sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by old property records and maps. The only sound was the ticking clock above the fireplace and the rain tapping against the window. I went through every document my grandfather left behind. Every deed. Every survey. Every boundary marker. And just like I expected, something didn't add up. Victoria wasn't confused about my property lines. She knew exactly where they were. The next morning, I installed 2 additional cameras around the ranch entrance. Not because I was afraid. Because I had learned something during my years of work. People who think they are untouchable eventually stop hiding. They start leaving evidence everywhere. That same afternoon, Victoria drove onto my property. Without permission. Her white SUV rolled across my gravel road, tires crushing the stones my grandfather had placed decades earlier. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and holding a folder. "I'm trying to help you, Ethan," she said. That sentence alone told me everything. People who are helping don't arrive with threats. They don't bring legal documents and police officers. They don't demand your keys. I looked at her and calmly asked, "What exactly do you think belongs to you?" Her smile disappeared for half a second. Just enough for me to see the truth underneath. "This community has invested heavily in this area," she replied. "It would be easier for everyone if you cooperated." Everyone. That word always means someone else is supposed to lose. I watched her leave my property that day knowing something important. Victoria still believed this was a simple fight between an HOA president and a stubborn ranch owner. She had no idea she wasn't fighting against my patience. She was fighting against the evidence I had been quietly collecting. And soon, she was going to make the one mistake people like her always make. She was going to use too much power in front of the wrong person. The most dangerous sentence I heard from Victoria wasn't a threat. It was when she said, "My brother will handle this." That was the moment I knew she was no longer pretending to follow the rules. The following morning, I woke up before sunrise, like I always did. The ranch was quiet except for the low hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of wind moving across the fields. I poured my coffee, stepped onto the porch, and looked over the land my family had protected for generations. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then my phone rang. It was a neighbor, Thomas Reeves, the man who lived 2 miles down the road. His voice sounded tense. "Ethan, you need to check your cameras." I walked back inside, opened the security app, and saw something that made my coffee go cold in my hand. Victoria had returned. But this time, she wasn't alone. A patrol vehicle was parked near my gate. Daniel Halstead stood beside it. The same officer who had come days earlier, demanding my ranch keys. Except this time, he wasn't holding a polite conversation. He was standing there with another officer, looking at my property like they were preparing for an operation. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The gravel beneath my boots cracked with every step. When I reached the gate, Daniel lifted his chin. "Mr. Caldwell, we need access to the property." I looked at him. Based on what? His expression changed slightly. Not because he didn't have an answer. Because he didn't expect me to ask. Victoria stepped out from behind him, holding a folder against her chest. "Ethan, please don't make this difficult." That sentence again. The same carefully rehearsed tone people use when they want to make aggression sound reasonable. I looked at the folder. "Is that supposed to be a warrant?" Victoria smiled. "No. It's an HOA enforcement document." I almost laughed. An HOA document. She had brought a police officer to my ranch because she believed a neighborhood association paper gave her authority over private property. Daniel stepped closer. "Sir, I'm advising you to cooperate." The way he said it bothered me. Not because he raised his voice. He didn't need to. The badge did the talking for him. That was the problem. Some people forget a badge represents responsibility, not ownership. I looked past him at Victoria. She wasn't watching me. She was watching Daniel, waiting for him to do what she wanted. That told me everything. This wasn't a legal issue. This was personal. I had spent years investigating people who hid behind positions of trust. Different industries, different backgrounds, different excuses. The pattern was always the same. They believed their title protected them. They believed nobody would question them. And eventually, they made a mistake. I calmly pulled out my phone and started recording. Daniel noticed. "You're recording this interaction?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. Victoria immediately looked uncomfortable. "Ethan, that's unnecessary." "No," I replied. "It's actually the only thing making this necessary." For the first time, the confidence on her face disappeared. Just for a second. But I saw it. The realization that this conversation was no longer happening in private. The realization that every word mattered. Daniel reached for the document folder. We're giving you one final chance to hand over the keys." I looked at the man standing in front of my ranch gate. A police officer. A brother protecting his sister. A person who had no idea he was stepping into something much bigger than an HOA dispute. I took a breath and looked at Victoria. "You really should have checked who you were trying to intimidate." She frowned. "What does that mean?" I smiled slightly. "It means you should have done your homework." They walked away that morning believing they had won another round. But they didn't understand something. The moment Daniel used his badge to support Victoria's scheme, he stopped being her shield. He became part of the evidence. The biggest mistake Victoria made was thinking my silence meant weakness. She didn't realize silence is usually where the strongest plans begin. After Daniel Halstead left my ranch that morning, I didn't chase after him. I didn't call the station. I didn't file a complaint. I simply closed the gate. Then I went back inside and started working. The first thing I did was create a complete timeline of everything that had happened. Every letter, every visit, every threat, every conversation. I wrote down dates, times, names, and exact words. People like Victoria depend on emotion. They want you angry. They want you shouting. They want you to make one mistake so they can point at you and say, "See? He's the problem." I refused to give her that. I had learned a long time ago that facts don't need to raise their voice. They just need to be found. That night, the glow from my computer screen was the only light in my office. Outside, rain tapped against the windows while I reviewed every document connected to Silver Pine Ranch Estates. The deeper I looked, the more problems appeared. The HOA records were full of inconsistencies. Meeting minutes had missing pages. Property discussions were approved without proper votes. And several documents related to my land had been changed after the original filings. Someone had been trying to create a paper trail. Hey, fake one. Victoria wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to manufacture authority. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The building smelled like old paper, dust, and coffee that had been sitting too long. The kind of place where history doesn't disappear. It just waits in filing cabinets. I requested every public record connected to my property and the surrounding development. The clerk handed me a stack of folders. "You're going to be here a while," she said. She was right. I spent hours going through documents, comparing signatures, checking dates, and matching records against what Victoria had sent me. Then I found it. A small detail most people would have missed. A boundary agreement. Buried beneath several pages of HOA paperwork was a clause stating that my ranch property was completely independent from Silver Pine Ranch Estates. The HOA had no authority over my land. None. Victoria knew that. Which meant every warning letter, every fine, and every threat from Daniel was built on something they knew was false. But that wasn't the worst part. I found another document. A development proposal showing Victoria's long-term plan. She wasn't trying to control my ranch because she cared about appearances. She wanted the access road. She wanted the land connection. She wanted the value that came with controlling the area around my property. The ranch wasn't a problem to her. It was an obstacle. I sat there staring at those papers, listening to the faint buzzing of the office lights above me. That was the moment everything became clear. Victoria had never underestimated my property. She had underestimated me. She thought I was just a man in boots who didn't understand paperwork. She didn't know paperwork was exactly where I was strongest. Over the next several days, I watched her make more mistakes. She sent more letters. She increased the pressure. She even had Daniel visit another neighbor, trying to convince them that my ranch was violating community agreements. But every move they made created another record, another timestamp, another piece of evidence. I kept saving everything, every email, every message, every document, because I knew eventually Victoria would make one final move. And when she did, I wanted her to understand something. The same system she used to intimidate people would become the system that exposed her. She thought she was building a case against me. She was actually building one against herself. The day Victoria realized she had lost control wasn't when I fought back. It was when I stopped reacting completely. She expected anger. She expected threats. She expected me to make a mistake. Instead, I gave her silence. And silence made her nervous. For the next 2 weeks, I watched Victoria move like someone who believed victory was already guaranteed. She walked around Silver Pine Ranch Estates with the confidence of a person who had never been challenged. She held meetings. She sent messages. She convinced people that my ranch was the problem. But every time she moved, she left another trail behind her. I kept collecting it. My office became a wall of information. Printed emails covered one side of my desk. Property maps were spread across the table. Security footage played quietly on my monitor. The strange thing about evidence is that it doesn't look powerful at first. A timestamp, a signature, a conversation, a simple photograph. Individually, they seem meaningless. But when you put enough pieces together, they tell a story. And Victoria's story was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, while reviewing the HOA meeting recordings, I noticed something unusual. Victoria had mentioned my property several times before she ever sent me a violation notice. That meant she had been planning this longer than she admitted. She wasn't reacting to a problem. She was creating one. I went deeper. I reviewed financial records connected to the development project near my ranch. Several payments had moved between companies connected to HOA board members. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would immediately attract attention. But enough small details to raise questions. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same companies. The same people benefiting from decisions that supposedly had nothing to do with them. That was when I understood Victoria's biggest mistake. She believed power came from being in charge of the room. She never realized power also came from knowing what happened before you entered it. A few days later, Daniel returned. This time, he came alone. His expression was different. Less confident. Less certain. He stood outside my gate, looking at the cameras mounted above him. "I need to talk," he said. I opened the gate but didn't invite him inside. "What about?" He looked uncomfortable. "Things have gotten complicated." I almost smiled. Complicated. That was the word people used when they didn't want to say they were wrong. I asked him one question. "Did you verify anything Victoria told you before you came here?" He didn't answer immediately. That pause told me everything. Daniel had trusted his sister because she was family. He had trusted his badge because people usually listened when he showed it. But he never checked the facts. And facts were the one thing Victoria couldn't control. Before he left, Daniel looked back at me. "You really don't seem worried." I looked across the ranch. At the old barn. The fence line. The land my family protected. "No," I said. "I'm not." He studied my face. "Why?" Because I knew something he didn't. The fight was no longer about a ranch. It was about accountability. Victoria had spent months building a false image of authority. She thought she could use the HOA, the paperwork, and even her brother's badge to force people into submission. But she never considered what would happen if someone documented everything. Someone patient. Someone prepared. Someone who understood how systems worked. The following morning, I made one final call. Not to Victoria. Not to Daniel. Not to the HOA. I contacted the people who needed to see what was happening. Because the next stage of this fight wasn't going to happen at my gate. It was going to happen where excuses stopped working. And where the truth finally had a chance to speak. The moment I opened the file and saw my own name connected to their investigation, I knew Victoria had made a mistake she could never repair. For months, she believed she was controlling the situation. She thought she was moving pieces around a board where everyone else was just a player. But she forgot one thing. Sometimes the person sitting quietly at the table is the one who knows the entire game. After my conversation with Daniel, I made the call I had been avoiding. Not because I needed help. Because the evidence had reached a point where it could no longer stay inside my office. The next morning, I drove away from the ranch before sunrise. The roads were empty, covered with a thin layer of morning fog. My headlights cut through the darkness as the mountains slowly disappeared behind me. I carried one folder. Inside were weeks of recordings, documents, photographs, and financial records. Everything Victoria had created. Everything Daniel had participated in. Everything they thought nobody would notice. When I arrived, I met with a small team that already understood why I was there. I didn't walk in as a ranch owner asking for protection. I walked in as someone presenting facts. No anger. No personal accusations. Just evidence. The first thing they asked me was simple. "Why didn't you reveal who you were earlier?" I looked down at the folder in front of me. Because revealing my identity would have changed their behavior. The moment Victoria knew who I was, she would have stopped making mistakes. She would have become careful. She would have hidden everything. And I didn't need her to be careful. I needed her to continue. I needed the truth to come from her own actions. That was something I had learned throughout my career. People rarely expose themselves when they think they are being watched. They expose themselves when they believe they have already won. Later that week, Victoria held another HOA meeting. She stood in front of a room full of homeowners, wearing the same confident expression she always had. She talked about protecting property values. She talked about community safety. She talked about residents who refused to cooperate. Everyone knew she was talking about me. Then Daniel stepped forward. He still wore his uniform. But something had changed. The confidence was gone. Victoria didn't notice. She was too busy enjoying the attention. We gave Ethan Caldwell every opportunity to comply, she announced. That sentence stayed in my mind. Because it was exactly the kind of statement that sounded powerful but revealed everything. They weren't enforcing rules. They were forcing compliance. And there is a difference. When the meeting ended, I received a message. The investigation had officially moved forward. The same people Victoria tried to impress were now reviewing every decision she had made. Every document she signed. Every conversation she had. Every time she used Daniel's position to pressure someone. The next day, Daniel came to my ranch again. This time, he didn't stand outside the gate. He waited. That alone told me everything had changed. I didn't know, he said. I looked at him. Didn't know what. That she was using me. The wind moved across the field between us. For the first time, Daniel wasn't standing there as a police officer. He was standing there as someone realizing he had been used. I didn't blame him, but I also didn't excuse him. Your badge doesn't make you responsible for someone else's lies, I said. But what you do after learning the truth matters. He looked toward the ranch. The same place he had once tried to take from me. Now he understood. Victoria didn't just challenge my ownership. She challenged the one thing she could never control. The truth. And soon, everyone in Silver Pine was going to see exactly who had been abusing power all along. The sound of the courtroom doors closing behind Victoria was quieter than I expected. But sometimes the loudest moments in life are the ones where nobody needs to shout. For months, she believed she was untouchable. She believed the HOA title, the connections, and Daniel's badge would protect her from consequences. She was wrong. The investigation moved faster than anyone in Silver Pine expected. Once every document was placed together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The false violations, the unauthorized property claims, the pressure placed on homeowners, the misuse of authority. It wasn't one mistake. It was a system built around the belief that nobody would challenge it. Victoria's confidence disappeared the moment she realized the people reviewing her actions weren't interested in her explanations. They were interested in the evidence. I watched from a distance as the same community meetings where she once controlled every conversation became the place where people finally started speaking. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for years came forward. They shared emails. They shared letters. They shared stories about the pressure they had faced. One person's complaint can be dismissed. 100 people with the same story cannot. That was the moment Silver Pine changed. Not because someone forced it to. Because people finally realized they weren't powerless. Daniel's situation was different. He had to face the consequences of trusting the wrong person and using his position without asking enough questions. The hardest part for him wasn't losing authority. It was accepting that his badge had been used as a weapon in someone else's personal fight. I saw him a few weeks later outside the county building. He looked different. Not physically, but the confidence was gone. The certainty. The belief that wearing a uniform automatically meant he was on the right side. You were right, he said. I looked at him, but didn't answer immediately. He continued. I should have checked everything myself. I nodded. That's the responsibility that comes with power. He looked down. I thought I was helping my sister. I know, I said. And I meant it. Because justice isn't always about destroying everyone who makes a mistake. Sometimes it is about making people understand the weight of their choices. Victoria didn't understand that until it was too late. The woman who once walked into meetings believing everyone had to listen to her was now answering questions from people she used to ignore. The same paperwork she used to intimidate others became the reason she lost control. The same rules she twisted became the rules that held her accountable. And the ranch? The ranch stayed exactly where it had always been. Mine. A few months after everything ended, I stood at the same gate where Daniel had once demanded my keys. The paint was still slightly worn. The old metal hinges still made the same sound when they moved. I placed my hand on the lock and remembered that first morning. The police vehicle. Victoria's smile. The confidence in their voices. They came believing they were taking something from me. But they gave me something instead. Proof. The kind of proof that cannot be ignored. Looking across the fields, I thought about how close everything came to being different. If I had reacted with anger, they would have used it. If I had revealed everything too early, they would have hidden their actions. Patience was the reason the truth survived. And that was the lesson Victoria never learned. Power doesn't belong to the person who demands respect. It belongs to the person who earns it. Because in the end, the keys to my ranch never left my hands. But the people who tried to take them lost everything they built their power on. The last time I saw Victoria Halstead, she wasn't standing behind a desk, giving orders. She was standing alone, looking at the same ranch gate she once believed she could control. The morning air was cold, but it felt different that day. The weight that had been hanging over Silver Pine for months was finally gone. The gate was still there. The ranch was still mine. And the people who thought they could take it had finally learned the cost of underestimating someone who refused to give up. After everything ended, I returned to a normal routine. At least, as normal as life can be after watching an entire community realize how easily power can be abused. I went back to fixing equipment, repairing fences, and walking the same trails my grandfather had walked decades earlier. The difference was that now, every step felt lighter. For months, I had carried the frustration of watching someone use authority like a weapon. Victoria didn't just try to take my keys. She tried to take away the feeling that people had any control over their own lives. That was the part that bothered me most. The ranch was important, but the principle behind it mattered more. Because if someone can convince you that your rights disappear the moment they become inconvenient, then the problem is much bigger than one piece of property. A few weeks after the investigation ended, I received a letter. Not from the HOA, not from Victoria, from several homeowners in Silver Pine. They thanked me, not because I had fought a battle for them, but because I had reminded them they were allowed to fight for themselves. That letter stayed on my desk for a long time. It reminded me that justice is rarely one dramatic moment. Most of the time, it is built quietly. One document, one decision, one person refusing to look away. People often think power belongs to the person with the loudest voice, the person with the title, the person surrounded by people who automatically agree with them. But I learned something during those months. Real power belongs to the person who can stay calm when everyone else expects panic. Victoria had numbers. She had influence. She had connections. But she didn't have the truth. And truth has a way of surviving. One evening, I stood outside the barn as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The same orange light covered the fields that had been there long before Silver Pine Ranch Estates existed. I ran my hand along the old wooden fence. The same fence Victoria once called a problem. The same fence she wanted removed because it didn't fit her vision. But that fence wasn't built for her approval. It was built for my family. And it was still standing. That was when I realized something. Victoria never really understood what she was fighting against. She thought she was fighting a stubborn ranch owner. She thought she was fighting someone who didn't understand the rules. But she was actually fighting someone who knew the rules better than she did. Someone who knew patience. Someone who knew evidence. Someone who knew that the truth doesn't need permission to exist. The ranch keys were still hanging where they always had been. Not because Victoria allowed it. Not because Daniel failed to take them. Because they were never theirs to take. That was the lesson I carried forward. A person can pretend to have power. They can wear a title. They can surround themselves with people who make them feel untouchable. But eventually, every person has to answer for what they do with that power. And when that day comes, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who wins. The truth does. And on my ranch, behind that old wooden gate, the truth was finally home.